Jerome Powell's out. Inflation's partying like it's 1979. And Kevin Warsh, yes, the billionaire-in-law Fed whisperer, might be the new sheriff in town. Brace your mortgage, your 401k, and maybe your sanity. This is what happened when the Fed stops playing nice and starts living in the real world. Good evening and welcome to iBanker News tonight on this very cold Saturday, January 31st, 2026. Hope you're bundled up and feeling warm because tonight's story, sadly, might give us all the chills. First, some housekeeping. We just finished our very first week of detailed reporting and could not have been more surprised by the support and the encouragement. The premise was simple: provide detailed interpretations of money and investing specific news through the lens of a practicing investment banker who is the sworn enemy of lying, smugness, tyranny, and other deceptions, guiding us all towards taking the wrong side of the trade, the money-losing side. Over 2,000 subscribers later, we are still here and promise to keep doing the same. However, a funny thing happened. Our videos started getting shadow banned. Viewer count started cratering. Thousands of views 1 hour, almost no views the next. Clearly a tiny and insignificant channel being recorded on an $80 Walmart Black Friday Vivitar special camera with really bad audio. That's not a threat, right? Well, if you found what we've started here to be useful and of value, we ask you if you would please consider helping spread the word. Help us shine a light on the issues that mainstream media refuses to touch. Vampires hate sunlight. Like, share, subscribe, comment, link in the comments to other forums. It all helps. If there are specific topics you know the mainstream media is ignoring and you would like us to cover them, please tell us in the comments. New microphone and better audio coming soon. Now, back to tonight's story. Every so often, Washington starts whispering a name it doesn't actually want to say out loud. Paul Volcker. I'll say that one a little bit louder in case you didn't hear. It's Paul Volcker. And here's how you know things are broken. Nobody invokes Volcker when the economy is healthy. You don't hear his name when CPI is at 2%, real wages are rising, and the dollar is trusted. Volcker only comes up when inflation is out of control, credibility is shot, and someone realizes the system has been running on borrowed time. So when people start drawing comparisons between Paul Volcker and Kevin Warsh, that's not nostalgia, that's a distress signal. Let's rewind, because history matters, and if the Fed pretends it doesn't, let's pretend it's 1979. The United States was coming apart economically. CPI inflation had blown past 13%. Core inflation was entrenched. Inflation expectations were unanchored. Oil shocks, wage price spirals, negative real rates. Savers were being wiped out in real terms. Bond yields were screaming that the Fed had lost control. The dollar was under pressure. Confidence was collapsing. People were standing hours in line just to fill up their gas tank. And politically, total paralysis. So Jimmy Carter, hardly a monetary hardliner, did something that would be unthinkable today. He appointed a Fed chair whose job was not to manage vibes, not to soothe markets, not to protect assets, but to kill inflation. Paul Volcker didn't fine-tune. He didn't jawbone. He didn't issue carefully calibrated forward guidance. He slammed the brakes. He abandoned interest rate targeting, and went after monetary aggregates, M1, M2, bank reserves. He let the federal funds rate float, and float it did, north of 20%. Mortgage rates followed, peaking around 18%. Housing collapsed. Unemployment surged above 10.8% in 1982. Industrial production cratered. Entire sectors were wiped out. Farmers protested outside the Fed. Home builders mailed him 2x4s in the shape of a cross. Congress threatened him weekly. And Volcker didn't blink. Why? Because Volcker understood something modern central bankers pretend is impolite to say. Inflation is not just an economic problem, it's a moral one. It's a regressive tax. It punishes savers, rewards leverage, distorts capital allocation, and eventually destroys reserve currencies. Let that sink in. We'll come back to that concept. And here's the part everyone forgets. Volcker wasn't just saving the U.S. economy. He was saving the dollar. During Volcker's tenure, the U.S. dollar was the unquestioned global reserve currency. Oil priced in dollars. Trades settled in dollars. Sovereign debt issued in dollars. Roughly 85% of global FX transactions involved the dollar. There was no serious alternative. By driving real rates sharply positive, Volcker made dollars scarce and valuable. Capital flowed toward the U.S. The dollar strengthened, credibility was restored, and that credibility bought the United States decades of growth, lower inflation volatility, and cheap global financing. Now, fast forward to today. Inflation spikes to levels we were told were impossible. CPI? It's important to note that CPI calculation variables have been changed. It's no longer a one-to-one comparison. Today's bastardized CPI is 2.7%, if you can believe that. However, if you use the same math used in 1979, when the CPI was between 11 and 13%, today's CPI would be about 8 to 11%, depending which economist you asked. Whatever it is, it's high, and core inflation proves sticky. Service inflation refuses to roll over. Shelter inflation lags and bites late. Real wages go negative for months. Household purchasing power erodes. And the Fed? First, inflation is transitory. Then, it's supply-driven. Then suddenly, it's everywhere. Rates finally rise, but late, gradually, carefully, always with one eye on equity markets, credit spreads, and political backlash. Which brings us to a basic question most Americans are never asked to consider. What does the Fed chair actually do? Because the way it's usually explained, some academic nudging rates by 25 basis points is nonsense. The Fed chair controls the price of money, not metaphorically, literally. The chair sets the agenda for the FOMC. He shapes the reaction function. He decides whether inflation is the primary enemy or whether financial conditions, what they are. He decides whether the Fed will tolerate asset deflation or intervene to stop it. One press conference can reprice the entire yield curve. One sentence can move trillions of dollars. One hint about terminal rates can change mortgage costs for 30 years. So the Fed chair decides whether leverage is rewarded or punished, whether savers or borrowers win, whether the dollar is defended or diluted, whether markets are allowed to fail. This is not a regulatory job. This is a command post. Which brings us to Jerome Powell. Powell was never meant to be Volcker. He was chosen as a stabilizer, a lawyer, not an economist, a consensus figure, someone who could communicate calmly, avoid shocks, and keep markets functioning. And for a while, that worked. Then came the pandemic. Then came $5 trillion in fiscal stimulus. Then came zero rates that held far too long. Then came quantitative easing, expanded to nearly $9 trillion on the Fed's balance sheet. Then came inflation. Oh boy, did it come. Powell's problem isn't that he raised rates. It's that he raised them late. And now he's boxed in. He's got an impossible set of Sophie's choices. First, he's trying to fight inflation, but without breaking the markets. Tighten policy while financing deficits running 6 to 7% of GDP. Shrink the balance sheet without blowing up treasuries. Talk tough while hoping growth bails him out. This is not a position of strength, and that's why people start whispering about replacements, not because Powell is weak, but because the moment has changed, which brings us to Kevin Warsh. Now let's be clear. This is a hypothetical. He's not in yet, but let's assume he is. Worsh, let's meet him, is a former Fed governor who sat inside the room during the 2008 crisis. He watched the QE being invented in real time, and unlike much of the central banking class, he didn't conclude it was harmless. For years, Worsh has argued that emergency policy became permanent architecture, that ultra-low rates distorted price signals, that QE inflated asset bubbles rather than productive investment, that the Fed blurred the line between monetary and fiscal policy by monetizing deficits and backstopping markets. In plain English, the Fed stopped price risk and started subsidizing it. If someone like Worsh were to take the chair and actually believe what he says, the implications would be severe. Higher for longer real rates, less tolerance for inflation overshoots, and an edge of the Fed put as a standing assumption, a re-anchoring of expectations through credibility, not reassurance. And now comes the leverage problem. In the Volcker era, Fed debt was roughly 30% of GDP. Today, it's 120% of GDP, 4 times. Corporate balance sheets are more leveraged. Households are more rate sensitive. Asset prices are built on zero rate discount models. The entire system is duration fragile, which means rate hikes don't just slow growth, they stress everything. But what's the alternative? Because here's the macro reality nobody likes to say out loud. The Fed chair doesn't just manage the business cycle, he manages living standards. Treasury yields feed directly into mortgage rates. Mortgage rates feed into housing costs. Housing costs feed into CPI. CPI feeds into wages, or the lack of them. Credit card APRs float with policy rates. Commercial real estate reprices. Pension assumptions break. Venture capital dries up. Zombie companies die. That's not abstract. That is lifestyle. Smaller homes, higher rents, delayed families, lower real consumption, permanent financial anxiety dressed up as adjustment. And it doesn't stop at the US border. Because the Fed doesn't just run American monetary policy, it runs the global dollar system. When the Fed tightens, dollar liquidity contracts, emerging market currencies weaken. Sovereign balance sheets crack, capital flows reverse. When the Fed eases, cheap dollars flood the world and misallocates capital. That privilege exists because the dollar is trusted. And today, that trust is no longer unconditional. The dollar still dominates, roughly 60% of global FX reserves, but for the first time in decades, de-dollarization isn't fringe. Central banks are diversifying reserves. Bilateral trade experimentation outside of the dollar is happening now. Not because there's a better alternative, but because inflation and debt make people hedge. Which brings us to treasuries, the core of the system. The US funds itself through auctions. When demand is strong, yields stay contained. When auctions are soft, when bid to cover ratios weaken, when foreign participation thins, when term premiums rise, that's not noise. That's the market asking to be paid. And higher yields don't just hurt bond traders. They hit mortgages. They hit rents. They hit equity valuations. They hit government interest expense, which is now approaching $1 trillion a year. This is how macro instability turns into lifestyle erosion. And yes, let's address the part people whisper about. Kevin Warsh is married into extraordinary wealth. The Estee Lauder fortune. Old money. Global consumer empire. The kind of wealth that does not depend on quarterly stock pops or cheap leverage. That matters. Not because it's scandalous, but because it changes incentives. Someone that wealthy does not need markets to levitate. Does not need asset inflation to preserve status. Does not need Wall Street applause. Which raises a dangerous possibility. What if the Fed chair doesn't care if markets like him? What if he's willing to let asset prices fall? What if he views inflated multiples, compressed credit spreads, and speculative leverage not as features, but as failures? Paul Volcker had that luxury. And that's why this comparison matters. Because Volcker forced America to answer a hard question. Do you defend the currency or the illusion? Do you protect purchasing power or asset prices? Do you accept short-term pain to preserve long-term credibility, or do you keep smoothing volatility until smoothing stops working? Because Volcker proved something once. You can survive pain if people believe it has a purpose. But here's the real danger today. We are more leveraged, more fragile, and less willing to accept sacrifice than we were in 1979. So if this is another Volcker moment, the stakes are higher. And if Kevin Warsh represents even the possibility of discipline, the reaction tells you everything. The system doesn't fear inflation, it fears restraint. So if the real question isn't whether Powell is out or Worsh is next, the real question is whether the United States still wants a Fed chair who will say no. Because if that question is yes, then this really is our Volcker moment. And if the answer is no, then the chair won't matter nearly as much as people think, because the decision will have already been made. And you might want to lock in that adjustable rate before it spikes. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. Please like, share, and subscribe if we have earned it, or comment what we can do better next time. We'll be back tomorrow with 2 videos. The first about personal asset allocation, the next about personal steps people can take to guard against rapid inflation. Until then, take care of yourself and each other.